to the Polgar Chess University. In this lesson, for a change, I'd like to talk about some opening ideas and specifically some traps in the French defense. Generally, I consider not very important to study openings for a beginner player. Typically, the games are decided sometime by tactics or checkmate combinations or such. The opening moves are not very important as long as you follow the opening principles, which are to control the center, to develop your pieces, and to put your king in safety. And there are a few not to-dos, namely, do not bring your queen out early, and do not move the same piece over and over in the early part of the game. Let's see our first example. White starts the game by playing e4, opening the diagonals of the bishop on f1 and the queen. At the same time, the white pawn on e4 occupies an important center square as well as controls the d5 square. Now, when black responds by playing e6, that's called the French defense. Here, typically white answers by putting a second pawn in the center to d4. And black does just the same by playing d5. With that move, black immediately attacks the white pawn on e4, and white needs to react to that. White has a number of ways to answer. One is, of course, to trade the pawns on d5. Another one is to push the pawn through and close the center by playing e5, ahead with the pawn. And other moves include protecting the pawn that has been attacked, either by the knight or the bishop. Most common and best moves for white are to protect the pawn on e4 with the knight, either from d2 or, as we shall see in this first game, by the knight moving to c3. Now, if the black pawn trades on e4, as black did in this game, white can simply recapture. In this position, black needs to develop, and he should do so by moving the knight to d7, for example. Another option would be, instead, to move the bishop to e7, followed by the knight coming out to f6. Black ideally does not want to bring the knight out first in this case, because then, after the exchange on f6, black has to choose from either bringing the queen out prematurely by capturing the knight, or capture back with the pawn, which would ruin the pawn structure. Having doubled pawns, that is, two pawns on the same file, typically is not a good idea because the pawn behind is limited in movement from the front pawn. Let's go back to the game. In this position, in this game, black continued by moving the bishop to d6. That's not a good idea, even though it's a developing move. While it is certainly not a blunder, it allows white right away, or perhaps at a later stage, to trade the knight for the bishop. Generally speaking, in a regular position, bishops are a tiny bit more valuable than knights. Of course, there are other situations where the knight may be more valuable, and that is the reason why both the bishop and the knight generally are considered the same value pieces, that is, 3 points each. However, at such an early stage of the game, it's not a good idea to allow your opponent to trade a knight for a bishop. White did not rush capturing the bishop, although it's certainly an idea to consider, but instead continued developing like nothing happens and played bishop to d3. And black also continued developing by playing knight to e7. Of course, another alternative could be to retreat the bishop to e7 to make sure that exchange between the knight and the black bishop will not happen. Instead, the game continued, as I mentioned, with knight e7, and white at this stage could continue developing by the knight to f3, perhaps the most natural move, but it seems that it's even stronger to develop the bishop instead. This move not only develops the bishop, but at the same time creates a pin over black's knight. Black answered by castling. This was already a serious mistake, allowing a winning combination for white. I suggest you try to pause for a few minutes the recording and try to figure out what would you do here if you would be playing with the white pieces. Priority in chess is extremely important. And as we know, we definitely want to safeguard our pieces, making sure we don't lose them and try to win our opponents. However, one thing is even more important, and that is the safety of the king. Therefore, there are times when we are willing to give up a valuable piece in order to expose our opponent's king to our attack. This is one of those situations where white sacrifices material, in this case sacrifices a knight, in order to remove one of the main guarding pawns in front of the black king. And the move is playing knight to f6 check. This is obviously attacking the king. If the king would move out of the check, white would have a number of good choices, one of them being simply capturing the pawn on h7. Another one, perhaps even better, would be to bring the queen out to h5. And this attack is pretty deadly for black. White is threatening to checkmate on h7. And then, if the pawn advances to h6, white would sacrifice the bishop on h6, capturing the pawn. Then, if pawn takes, queen takes pawn, arriving checkmate. Or, if instead of capturing the bishop, black captures the knight, the situation is not much better because white could simply move the bishop almost anywhere but capturing the rook, which of course is not bad either, but not the best. Anywhere else the bishop moves, the black king is in a check. It's called a discovered check. And then when the black king moves, regardless where g8 or g7, the checkmate arrives with the queen on h7. Let's go back and continue with the game, where after the knight check on f6, black of course could capture the knight right away instead of moving the king out of the check. So let's see how that continues. Black captured the knight and white simply slowly recaptured the pawn on f6. What happened now? Black's pawn from g7 that was guarding the black king has disappeared. And that means that the white queen is ready to come to attack the black king on g8. Namely, the white queen at the moment is threatening to come to g4. And that would be a killer check to the black king, because the king would have no place to go. And at the moment, the knight is also pinned, so if the knight would try to block the check, the black queen would get lost. It wouldn't help much if black at this point would move the rook to e8, trying to make an escape square for the black king, because after the queen g4 check and king f8, again the checkmate would arrive with queen to g7. Again, let's return to the game position. After bishop takes f6, black continued by moving his queen. The best choice relatively here was to try to get the queen into the defense, and to do that real quick by giving a check for white. Of course, white does not need to move his king, but can and should block the check with a pawn. And then black would get a moment of breath to bring the queen. And the point is that now the black queen is no longer in the pin. And if white would continue again with the same check, then the black knight would arrive on g6, blocking it without losing the queen. And other than that, after queen d5, black is threatening also the g2 pawn, and then trapping the rook in the corner, and probably most importantly, taking away the g4 square from the white queen that is controlling it once the black queen arrives to g2. Black instead in the game moved the queen out of the pin immediately, moving it to d7. And that is not a successful idea, because while it solves one problem, creates or allows a different one. Namely, white now has a forced checkmate in 3 moves. Can you see what those are? The first move is yet another sacrifice. We already sacrificed the knight for just the pawn, and now the next step is white needs to sacrifice a bishop. And that comes bishop h7, leaving black with only one choice, king takes bishop, and then the queen comes to h5 check, forcing the black king back to g8, and then checkmate arrives in the corner. Very nice. Okay, let's move on to our next game. Here we go. Again, we're staying with the French defense. White starts the game in a similar fashion like the first game, playing e4, e6. That's already the French defense. White again occupied the center, and so did black. And white again protected the pawn with the knight by playing knight to c3. In this game, black did not trade immediately on e4, but instead moved his knight to e7, which is not the best way to continue because it locks in the bishop on f8. It's considered much better to either develop the bishop to b4, which would create a pin over the white knight on c3, or instead move the knight to f6 and put pressure on the pawn on e4 a second time. Black instead continued by playing knight to e7, and white developed with bishop to d3. And now black thought that he gets tricky. He traded the pawns, and when the white knight recaptured, black thought that he can safely capture this pawn on d4. How wrong he was. And this is a very important trick and trap to remember that is very typical for the French defense, but of course it happens in some other openings as well. The problem now is that the black queen is on an unprotected square, and white is able to give a discovered check by moving the bishop to the b5, checking the black king, and then, regardless what black's answer is, the black queen will be lost. And let's move on to our next example. And we are staying with the French defense still. d4 and d5. And here, in this game, white chose a different answer than protecting the pawn, namely playing e5, the advanced variation. Black for now responded correctly by playing c5, trying to undermine the white pawn on d4. If white would now trade pawns immediately on c5, the black bishop could recapture, and black would have a pretty good position. At this stage, white protected the pawn with c3 with the idea that if black trades pawns on d4, white would like to see a pawn recapturing there, not another piece. And here black made the first mistake by rushing with that very trade of pawns on d4. It's much better for black to delay that, and typically black would play knight c6 and then oftentimes even bringing the queen out, pressuring the pawns both on d4 as well as on b2. Another typical plan in such positions is to bring the queen out, which is an exception from the rule, because typically we do not like bringing the queen out early in the game. However, in this particular pawn structure and type of position, black aims to get rid of his light squared bishops by moving the bishop through d7 to b5, offering a trade against the white bishop on f1. The reason why this would help black is that the pawns in the center on e6, e5, d5, and d4 are blocked in, so those pawns are not likely to go anywhere in the foreseeable future. And what that means is that the light squared bishop of black on c8 is in a pretty limited position of activity. So what we would consider the light squared bishops, the white one is the good bishop versus the black one, the bad. And the contrary, because of the white pawns being on dark squares, they are greatly limiting the mobility of their dark squared bishop. So therefore, white's dark squared bishop would be considered the bad bishop versus black's the good bishop on f8. What that means is that black has a potential eventually to attack those pawns on the dark squares, while white at best can only defend them. And vice versa, the light squared bishops of white has a potential to attack the black pawns on the light squares, and all the black light squared bishop can do is to defend them. Okay, so we're back to the game where black in this position, as I said, traded a bit prematurely on d4 and then gave a check, which again is not the greatest idea, because if white chooses to, white could just block the check with the bishop, and as we just established, the exchange of the dark squared bishops is to white's benefit. White, on the other hand, blocked the check with the knight, which is an inferior move. Now black continued developing with the knight to c6, and came knight to f3, developing, and knight ge7. The developing process continues, and here black prematurely has castled. That's a mistake, because it allows a very typical combination, and I'd like you to remember this pawn formation, which is very characteristic for the French defense. Unlike in most openings when you'd want to castle as soon as possible, in this case when you see this pawn formation in the middle of the board and this type of development of the white pieces, you need to be aware of a typical combination of white sacrificing the bishop. Obviously, if black does not capture the bishop, white just won a pawn. So let's see what happens if black indeed does capture. The white knight appears on g5 with a check. Now the black king has a good number of squares to go to, but none of them can really save the game. The worst of them all is to move the king to h8, which allows an immediate checkmate in two moves, white bringing the queen, followed by checkmate on h7. If the king instead goes to h6, it's not advisable either because it steps into the diagonal of the white bishop and the white knight can jump, for example, to f7, giving a double check, and then when the black king moves out, white just captures the black queen on d8. So now let's move back and see some of the more challenging moves. What happens if the black king retreats to g8, simply goes home? Well, then the attack continues. White will play queen to h5, threatening with checkmate on h7, when the only response is to move the rook to e8 to clear space for escape for the black king, and then queen h7, king f8, queen h8 check, king knight blocks on g8. We keep continuing to chase the king, and now, very importantly, we bring a new piece to the attack, bring the bishop. Now, if the king moves out of this check, the black queen will be lost. And if black blocks the check with a pawn, then queen g7 is a checkmate immediately. Relatively the best answer for black is to block the check with a knight, which at the same time also attacks the white queen in the corner. But then comes queen takes pawn on g7. And white is 2 pawns ahead, while it's true that black is up a knight, but not for long. As you can see, that knight is being attacked 4 times actually. And sadly for black, that black knight on f6 is in a pin, and it cannot run away. And finally, let's go back to the position where black king has to make a choice where to go. Let's see what happened in a game where the king moved to g6. This is by far the best option for black. And now white has several ways to continue. One of the most typical ones would be to play queen g4 and bring the queen to the attack immediately. But in this case, it's even better to first advance the h-pawn to h4. This creates an immediate threat to advance the pawn even further to h5 to chase the king to an even more unfortunate square than it's already on. Black responded by sacrificing the knight on d4, trying to deflect white from his own attack. But in reality, it doesn't help. White still can proceed by advancing the pawn. Now, if the black king moves to h6, again, there is a discovery with a knight jumping to f7. And if the king goes to f5, typically it cannot end well because king in the middle of the board with still queens on the board is almost always likely to get checkmated. Now, the pawn on e5 is under attack, so white can calmly capture that black knight on d4. Now white has multiple checkmate threats between them, advancing the pawn or moving the queen to f4. There's not much that black can do about it. Black tried to deflect White from his plans by capturing on c3 the knight with a check, but now White will of course capture back with the pawn, leaving the important piece, the queen, where it is to aid the checkmate. And now Black is completely helpless against the two checkmate threats with queen f4 and the pawn moving to g4. Black played knight c6, attacking the queen. That of course doesn't help. The checkmate still arrives. Well, I hope you learned some interesting and important ideas in the French defense that you can either use for your own benefit or avoid some of the traps you saw for the losing side. Thank you for listening, and so long until next week.